thanks very much to Kevin and Ryan for coming along to today's session. The idea from my side is really kind of twofold. Firstly, to give a bit of background about the impact calculator and how it works, and put it in the context of some other tools that might also be out there in terms of measuring benefits and impact. And then after that, which hopefully won't take that long, is to give you a chance to then ask any questions, either detailed or general, that you've got about the impact calculator, to see if we can get you up and running with it. It would be useful perhaps just before we kick off just to hear about where you're at with it at the moment with your project. Is it something that you've not yet looked at at all, or is it something you've downloaded, had a bit of a play with, but not used seriously, or have you been trying to use it, or indeed using it, but got some sort of nitty-gritty technical issues to discuss? It'd just be useful to get a handle on that side of things from you.
Okay. Well, we at Sunderland, we've downloaded it and looked at it. From the project's point of view, we've got the RMAS project where I think we're just about ready to try and measure impacts, and it would be a good way to do that. We also have a couple of other JISC projects, and I expect that it would be useful for that. So I'm interested in basically learning about how it works and seeing how well we can apply it. We haven't actually done it yet. We're at that point in the project where we're wanting to start to look at it and generate outputs of that type. So I think that's where we are at Sunderland.
Okay, thanks Kevin, that's useful, and hopefully this session should be pitched about right in that case then. So just to really to give a bit of background to the tool and why we developed it and how we developed it, it actually came out of some concerns that I had in particular as a records manager. I was increasingly going to workshop sessions, conference sessions, where there were a lot of claims being made for the efficiencies that could be delivered through investment in records management. But when I asked questions about where some of the source data was coming for this, no one was really ever able to pin me down and say, right, well, this is how we know the savings are going to be made. So we undertook a literature survey, literature review back in 2009 to just see whether this was just anecdotal experience of myself or whether this was evidence of a wider problem. And what I've got here is three of the, I think there was about half a dozen or so of the main findings, and these are the ones that really spurred us on to develop the impact calculator, because we realized that in relation to records management there didn't seem to be much by way of literature of data when it came to benefits and efficiency measurement. And I think part of that is because traditionally in records management, as in a lot of other areas of sort of information management, a lot of the arguments and the business case that's been used to justify expenditure has really been of a more intangible nature. So it's been around compliance and governance and corporate accountability, those sorts of things, which are absolutely fine and rock solid as a business case. But that's very different to being able to say, as people were beginning to, it will save you this much money, it will reduce your overheads by so much. And what we did find, and this was really, I guess, the sort of the killer, is that where there was evidence about efficiency gains, that actually when you delved a little deeper, what you actually found was that it wasn't at all supported by what you'd consider to be robust evidence, empirical data, etc. It tended to be pretty nebulous, and it tended to be fairly flaky, to be honest. So with that in mind, what we found was fairly soon was that this isn't actually something that's just unique to records management, that actually when it comes to looking at benefits, particularly financial benefits across any sort of change initiative, you often find this is the case. It is very difficult to either to estimate and or then to prove that this investment is saving you money in the way that you suggest that it will do. And so very quickly, what had started out as a records management specific tool, if you like, a tool to meet a particular challenge, was or had potentially a much broader applicability, not just to records management or even to information management, to any sort of change process within an institution. That could be introducing a new technology, it could be introducing new ways of working, policies and procedures, basically anything that has some sort of change that you can measure potentially can be used, the impact calculator can be used for. Obviously, there are JISC projects. This is nothing new. JISC projects have always been required to prove at the end of the project what they've achieved and to write final reports and so forth, giving that sort of evidence back to JISC and the sector. But I think obviously what you're beginning to see is an increased focus on being able to do that for obvious reasons. Anything that's funded from the public purse, it's increasingly important that it's able to show how it's delivering bang for its buck effectively. So for the projects, there are multiple reasons why you may need to demonstrate impact. Clearly, that whatever the project is, there should be an institutional driver for it, and there will be institutional stakeholders and sponsors who are looking to see impact and benefit being derived through the project. Then obviously there will be a cohort of peers within the sector, those working in the same area, on the same projects, same types of projects, etc. A community of practice out there that you want to be able to demonstrate impact and benefits to. And then obviously back to JISC itself, because there's a certain food chain at work here whereby JISC at a program level will need to be able to demonstrate impact, and in order to do that it needs to be able to rely on some project level impact analysis. And then of course there's just the whole kind of personal curiosity and satisfaction. You want to know that a good job has been done and that you've managed to achieve some of the benefits that you set out to achieve. So there's various different sort of flavors and nuances on it, but I think the underlying fact is that being able to justify and demonstrate the impact that your project's had is kind of here to stay as a requirement of JISC funding, and I suspect of funding from lots of other sources too. It's worth pointing out that of course the impact calculator is only one such tool, and what we soon became aware of is that there's a whole host of tools that JISC and others have developed over the years, which are different ways of enabling you to measure something that you do. And what we did late last year was to gather all of these together in one place through our measurement tools wiki, which then provides you with various ways of actually accessing the tools, working out which one is going to be of use to you, and it gives you a summary of information for each about whether it provides qualitative or quantitative information, whether it's actively supported or it's a sort of legacy tool, and whether it's a maturity model or a calculator and what it does. So the URL for that will come along a bit later on, but it's really to make the point that obviously the impact calculator is only one of these tools, but is the one that we're going to be focusing on today, but others are out there as well. And certainly one of the tools that's actually featured in there, but in itself is useful in this regard, is the BILLS project from Strathclyde, which actually is designed to make you aware of the variety of tools that are out there and to give you a framework to consider what might be the best sort of evaluation for your project, depending on its nature and the type of environment you're operating in. So as you can see from this quadrant diagram here, in the top right you can see financial evaluation is likely to feature highly where quantitative data is required for internal consumption, which is really the kind of space that we're talking about here with the impact calculator. So that's where it's pitched, if you like, in terms of this framework of evaluation types. So we developed the impact calculator, launched it in October 2009, and then launched a slightly revised version 2 years later in October last year. There's a voluntary registration process of which we've had 405 registered downloads to date, but we know from web stats that that's only about 10% roughly of the total downloads. We're looking at somewhere around about 3,500–4,000 downloads as we speak at the moment, and as you can see from this Google map from all over the place, it's getting quite a lot of interest, not only within HE but also across the commercial sector and across other branches of the public sector as well. And what we did do when we launched the first version is we funded 6 pilot projects in the institutions you can see listed at the bottom there, and these were particularly focused on various types of records management project, but were all had the impact calculator at their core, and all had to use it and to promise to make their resources available at the end. I'm just going to break off there just briefly because I can see that Anna's still having problems. Let me just respond to her text message. Sorry, it's the joys of presenting and moderating at the same time. Okay. So how does the impact calculator work? Well, this diagram is really the sort of the highest level kind of overview that there is, and it really just takes you through the major steps in terms of how it works. As you'll have seen if you've taken a little look at it already, the whole thing is based very much around the measurement of processes, and this is deliberate, because what we're trying to do is work out the benefit to the institution. You know, it's one thing that, has this system been successful? Have we implemented a system? Great, we have, but actually what benefit is being derived through the regular business processes of the university of implementing that system? So what we try and do is have the process at core, and then work from there. So the first thing to do is to identify a process that is going to be subject to a change, and that can be defined at various levels, and the impact calculator can be defined and used at various levels, as we've kind of seen, and there are lots of decisions that can be made around using the calculator, depending on its usage and your requirements. Then it's a question of identifying the benefits that you want to measure, and we're not prescriptive in this. The calculator is not prescriptive. If you want to measure time saved, that's fine. If you want to measure money saved, that's great. Space, we can talk about some of the metrics later on, but it's an open tool in that regard, and we rely on you to say how you want to measure and what you want to measure. Then obviously, in order to know how you've improved something over time, you need to know how it is at the moment, so you need to measure that process using those benchmarks at the beginning, before you introduce something, before you change anything, so that you've got a benchmark of current performance. After that, you remeasure after you've made the changes, or you can do it in advance predictively based on what you know about improvements, or perhaps you're going to pilot a small improvement in one area and use that to forecast what it's likely to deliver ultimately. Then remeasure with your actuals, and then you can calculate some impact. There is actually one stage missing out of that diagram, which is also the calculation of costs, because obviously just measuring benefits is only half the equation, and if you're not actually including the costs of making the change somewhere along the line, then you're not having a true picture of the changes that are being made. So what I'm just going to really sort of finish up with for the last part of the presentation before we go into the Q&A session is to talk you through an example of how the calculator has been used by one of the pilot projects. In this case, it's Nottingham University. Now, because screen grabs from Excel don't render particularly well into PowerPoint and then into Collaborate, what I've done is I've kind of mocked up extracts from the calculator so that we can see the numbers, if you like. So this isn't how it looks in reality, which you'll know if you've had a look at it, but it's really for the purposes of this demonstration so that we can dwell on the bits that we need. So the calculator is an Excel spreadsheet, which again is a deliberate choice because it's a tool that not only does exactly what we need it to do, but is obviously also one that's familiar to people on their desktop, so there's no need to get your head around new software types and new ways of working, etc. The first stage, as I mentioned, is really to outline a business process. In this case, and this is only an extract of it, but basically what Nottingham were wanting to do was to replace a previously manual process for administering student complaints and disciplinary process, which involved letters being sent out through internal mail, inviting students to attend disciplinary meetings, doing the same with academics to get them on board, delivering papers through internal mail in preparation for those meetings, etc., and replacing that with essentially a workflow system that enabled that to be done electronically. So the process has been defined, and then I've listed 3 of the benefits that they wanted to measure. There were more in this instance, but these are the three that I've just chosen for illustration purposes. So they wanted to look at the reduction in time taken to post those case files from teams to schools, and vice versa from schools back to the governance team, and the reduction in time to post case files from governance teams to adjudicators. There were others involved looking at things like reduction in paper costs and storage costs, because they were no longer having to physically store lots of papers in one place prior to sending out, etc., freeing up office space. So the tool enables you to work to record those benefits that you want to measure. And in many respects, this is the key screen, I guess, where you actually start to capture data on the metrics that you've defined. And just to note that all the text that you can see in blue is text that's entered by the user, and the dark grey is then generated by the system, so calculated from the data that you've put in. So as we can see in grey at the top here, this particular metric is that they wanted to measure is the reduction in time taken to post case files to schools looking at the new system. So what we first need to do is to work out what is the unit of measurement, and this is where we get into levels of granularity and what's appropriate for the task in hand. In this instance, they've decided that it's minutes. It could be seconds, depending on the process. It could be hours, unlikely, and even if it was hours, you're more likely to calculate it in terms of minutes anyway. So because it's a time-based thing, they're looking at reduction in time, it's minutes. So equally, if it was a space saving, it could be in square meters, it could be CO2 emissions, it could be all sorts of different things. Then it's a question of defining the area of change. So the measurement is minutes, but actually how that time is being used in this case is minutes per case file per year. That's the metric that we're wanting to measure. So for year one, as you can see as a benchmark figure, they're saying that it takes them just over 17 minutes, 17.25 minutes at the moment to physically post that case file to the school. So that they've almost done a kind of time and motion study here, stopwatch, timed how long it takes somebody, done it several times, maybe they've averaged it to produce that figure. The annual multiplier then says, well, how many times do you do that a year? Because obviously you need to know that in terms of calculating the total volume. So looking back through their previous history, they can say that perhaps on average, or perhaps as an actual, this is where there is some flexibility here, this is a process that they do 312 times a year. And then if we move over to the right-hand column, the year one actuals, what they're saying is that after the introduction of the system, that time has now been cut per case file from 17.25 minutes to 5 minutes. And also in this case, which is slightly unusual, but this kind of shows the flexibility of the system, there's actually been a reduction in the annual multiplier. So because of the system, because it's managed to streamline some processes, they're actually reducing the number of times that they have to do this process as well, from 312 to 280. So the calculator then churns that up and says that that's a performance saving of 71%, which in itself can then be used as an indicator of impact, regardless of any monetary value. It might be sufficient, or it might be useful at any rate, to know that through this system we now have improved the efficiency of it by 71%. But ordinarily people want to go one step further and say, well, that's great to know that, but actually what does that mean in terms of pounds, shillings and pence, which is the bottom half of the screen effectively, where what we're then doing is converting our unit of measurement, the minutes, into a salary cost per minute. So there's also some work to be done outside the calculator in terms of working out the staff grade of the person involved, and then they're looking at their annual salary, and then turning that right down into a per minute salary, including on costs. These are all the decisions that need to be made along the way about the basis on which you're going to calculate that. Again, what's slightly different here, but again perfectly acceptable and perfectly useful actually to put in, is that as you'll see on the year one actual figure, the salary per minute's gone up. And there was a reason for this, is because they felt that because the process has been turned into an electronic process using a system, that it was actually something that needed to be performed at a higher grade than previously, which was seen to be a lower grade sort of clerical role. So their salary cost per task had actually gone up, almost doubled as a result of this. But as we can see, as we sort of go down to the annualized performance, even with that in mind, it's gone to, they're actually saving £359 per year. So I'm happy to pause at this moment to see whether anyone's got any questions on that, because I know there's a lot of information there, or alternatively we can sort of keep walking through the process and then I can take some questions at the end if everyone's kind of comfortable with that. Unless I hear otherwise, I will move on. I'm glad to see that some from St Andrews have managed to join us and hopefully are able to talk afterwards when we come to the Q&A session, so good to have you on board.
Thanks, Steve. That's very useful. I've been following in. I haven't got any questions at this stage, but that's great.
Perfect.
And I think,
okay,
I don't know whether there's several people from St Andrews or whether that's Scott having about 3 goes on about 3 different machines.
Well, we might find out when we get to the Q&A session afterwards. Okay. So that previous slide would be repeated obviously for each metric that you'd identified. There is no limit to the number of metrics that you can use to measure a process. You know, it can be 1, it can be 20, 30, it's entirely up to you, but you'd repeat that level of data capture for each and every metric that you'd identified, and obviously that will then be built up to start getting a sort of portfolio of benefits, if you like. But then, as I said at the outset, it's important to capture costs as well, the other side of the equation. An early iteration of the impact calculator, we had a much more complex sheet for data capture when it came to costs, reflecting all sorts of breakdown of sort of hardware costs, software costs, consultancy costs, training, and all sorts of things. And then what we realized at a fairly early stage of development was that was, for our purposes, irrelevant. What we really needed were the costs that I'll outline in a little while for the process of working out, you know, cost benefit. But there's another reason for doing it, is that we know that obviously institutions have well-established ways already of slicing and dicing project costs, for example, you know, depending on their finance system and depending on how they administer their projects. And what wouldn't have been a popular decision would be to have to get people to then extract all their data out of the way that they measure it for their institutional benefit and to have to rechurn it for the way that we wanted for no real benefit. So what we've done instead is to break it down into just staff costs and non-staff costs, which is a pretty clear barrier. And then the only other real division is to acknowledge that most projects will have some upfront implementation costs. So, you know, these is reflecting things like buying software licenses, initial training for perhaps, you know, all staff training if it's a new software system, maybe some consultants that are involved in the implementation of the project. So all those kind of upfront project costs. And then after that, we start to get into sort of the business as usual costs. So it might be annual renewal of licenses, it might be training new staff, any additional costs that roll on year to make the system happen and work and function. So those are recorded, as I say, at a fairly high level, but at the level that's required for the calculator to do what it needs to do. And then this is really a reflection of data that's been put in. As you can see, there's no blue text here, so there's no data that's added by the user. This is the calculator doing what it's designed to do, in effect, and giving you a summary of the state of play. So what we can see here is that in year one, it's running at a deficit, as you'd probably expect. You know, upfront costs are factored into that, and so it's running at a £9,000 deficit. What you start to see in year 2 is that it's actually running at a surplus. It made just over £4,000 profit, if you like, but we're still in negative territory in terms of the cumulative monetary impact, because we're still chipping away at the £9,500 deficit that we ran up. Likewise, in year 3, we're still running at just over £4,500 surplus, and we've reduced the deficit to £800. And then in year 4, we've broken even, and then we're actually accruing benefit all the way through. So that's, if you like, a text-based summary of impact. It enables you to see when you're beginning to see a return on the investment and when you've actually broken through, if you like, and are actually operating at an accumulating profit year on year. You'll see at the bottom under section 4, non-monetary impact. This is because we're aware that there are often times when you may want to measure a benefit, but it's not actually one that you can derive a particular monetary benefit from. So, for example, saving of storage space. Now, interestingly, some of our pilots thought you could attach a cost to that. If it costs money to store records, for example. It costs lighting, heating, security, upkeep, uptake of the space, etc. And they attached a monetary value to that. Others said, well, no, we're not going to do that. Yes, we're achieving a space saving, and that is a benefit we want to capture. But actually, even if we take the records out, we've still got to heat that space, still got to light that space, so we're not actually saving any money. But the calculator enables you to capture that benefit and say it's up to you whether you then want to turn it into a monetary saving or not, or just to say, yes, we saved 44 linear meters of storage space by the end of year 5, which we can then reuse to house staff or students or whatever. So again, there's that flexibility in the tool in terms of whether you want to turn everything into a financial benefit or whether in some cases you just want to capture a non-financial benefit. One of the projects we had actually, again with regard to space, had actually transferred a space saving into workstations, because space was a real premium for the university in question, and they wanted to be able to turn around and say to their senior management, through this project we've got rid of so many linear feet of records, which equates to 5 workstations where we can put staff, and that would seem to be a powerful driver in terms of their staff. And then the calculator will give you a couple of nice diagrams, which are useful in terms of reporting to management, etc. This one showing the point at which the project has obviously broken even, achieved a return on investment, and showing that by the end of year 5 it has made just over £8,000 profit. And you can see from the direction of the curve whether that's going to continue over into the longer term or not. So that's really the experience of, or an overview of how the tool works. What I thought I would just finish up by really is looking at some of the top hints that we gathered from the pilot projects. They are available on the website, as is more from the lessons learned from the pilot projects. But it's just, these were common pretty much to all of them, so it's certainly worth bearing in mind when it comes to thinking about using the calculator. One is to ensure that you've got full support from management. I mean, I think that applies to pretty much any IT project, so will come as no surprise here. Certainly the projects found that spending time at the beginning of the project to gain a more detailed understanding of the calculator and what you're trying to measure is time well spent. A lot of the projects kind of started off thinking, oh well, had a bit of a superficial skim of it, thought, right, we're going to measure this, and then realized halfway through, for whatever reason, that it was actually going to be very complicated to do so, or that they could capture the metric, but it wasn't really telling them anything useful. So it is worth stopping and thinking, what is it we're going to measure, and what is that going to tell us at the end of it? A lot of them also realised this was a good opportunity to start talking to colleagues across the institution, because rather than trying to second guess how much it costs the university to store a gigabyte of data or to store a square metre of records in office space, there are people in the university who are likely to know that, be they in IT or be they in the estates office or finance, and it's worth asking around first rather than spending a long time trying to work these things out for yourself. The bottom one of the first column about considering the intended purpose and audience for the findings, I think is a very important one, and one that we might touch on after I finish moving into the sort of discussion element, because there is a lot, as you'll have seen already, of decisions that can be made along the way about, are you happy to rely on estimates? Are you happy to rely on averages? Do you only want to measure what you can be 100% sure that you can capture so that your data is completely robust? There is no right or wrong answer. It depends entirely on the context, and I think it depends on transparency and discussion with the ultimate audience. What are they going to be happy with? What's appropriate for their decision-making process? The calculator can do garbage in, garbage out. It can do quality in, quality out. It doesn't mind, but you will only get out what you put in. So, and I think that's really continued in the next one in terms of considering whether estimates and predictions might be appropriate or not. It's certainly worth not ignoring the non-financial metrics. As has been said, they can be captured within the calculator and can be equally useful depending on the context and what's relevant within the institution. And it's certainly worth being prepared to stop and maybe change course halfway through. When you get a better understanding of the calculator, you're likely to see what's easier to capture, what's better to capture than other things, and it might be that you decide to drop some metrics and rethink some at the beginning or towards the end of the project even. Think carefully about the project timescales, because it will take more time to do this. Obviously there is a certain amount of work involved, particularly at the granularity of the data that's required, and that should be built into any project plans. And lastly, and also quite interestingly, not to be discouraged if actually it turns out that your project is not delivering or not predicted to deliver the kind of financial benefits that you'd hoped. It isn't always an indicator of failure by any stretch. We had one project looking at personnel files at Cardiff University, where the change was going to cost the university money year on year, but because it was also going to make them more compliant with regards to the Data Protection Act, they felt that that was a cost that was justifiable, and the project was still a success in its own right. But at least management had the data to hand to be able to make that cost-benefit analysis and say, this is going to cost us, I think from memory it was £4,000 a year, but actually we think that's money well spent because it means that we are now compliant with the DPA. Whereas without using this, there would have been really whistling in the wind in terms of how much does this cost us, is it worth us doing it, etc. So a few more comments and quotes from the project saying, yes, I would spend more time before the project considering the metrics and data collection methods, so that time up front is certainly well spent. The need to be realistic about the scope and capacity of doing this in the context of project and ongoing service delivery. Again, another one about spending more time up front deconstructing a process and making sure you understand the process end to end before working out which metrics you want to apply. And about the need to make relationships and to use those relationships in terms of actually getting some data and access to some of the data that you're likely to need. A couple of URLs. I can make this presentation available and send it through afterwards, so you don't need to sort of scribble them down now, but I've got the URLs there for the Measurement Tools Wiki, which includes all of the JISC-funded calculators and maturity models and benchmarking tools that it's developed over the years. There's the BILLS project from Strathclyde, which gives you a framework for deciding what sort of evaluation you may want to use within your projects. And then there's a link obviously to the impact calculator itself and all of the pilot materials as well. So that's really the end of what I wanted to to say in terms of background and a bit of an overview as to how the calculator works. So I'm happy to sort of open it up now in terms of a general discussion, and obviously to answer any questions you might have. I've posed a few questions there, but really only to sort of get us started, and feel free to ignore them or use them as you see fit. But I will open it up now to anyone who's got any questions or comments.
Okay, if I can start. Thanks so much, Steve. That's really interesting, and I think you've confirmed one or two thoughts that I'd had before we started, because when we were first looking at this, we began considering estimates of time saved on some of the business processes that we were modifying with RMAS. And it struck me, and I noticed you've highlighted this a few times, you've got to be very careful about the input data, and if you're going to be estimating time saved and so on, you've got to be quite careful to ensure those estimates are accurate. We were looking at numbers of days saved on different parts of a process that was being repeated many hundreds of times in the particular business context we're looking at. And because of that, the time saving was getting multiplied up, by a couple of thousand in the case of the example I'm talking about. And of course, most of your cost is staff time and on costs, and everything attached to staff time. So if you have a process that takes 4 days, and following your change it can be accomplished in 2 days, and you're multiplying that up by 2,000, then that's going to have a very big impact indeed. And if someone comes along and says, well, actually it's not 2 days, it's 3 days, you can chop in half this massive impact that you previously calculated on the basis of someone's idea of how long something's going to take, being nearer 3 days than 2. Yeah, it's the old statistical thing. You've got to be extremely careful of your starting point data and make sure you get that right. Otherwise, you can end up doing, as you say, it'll do garbage in, garbage out, as well as some good quality analysis. If you're not really on the money, pardon the pun, with your starting information, you can get almost anything out of it.
That's absolutely right. And I think there's a couple of points to sort of pick up on there. One is about this sort of the notion of averages and staff grades, for example, is a good example of that. We had one project which was looking at rather than sending records off-site for storage and having to retrieve them, they were just reducing the number of records, so reducing the number of records held off-site and the number of retrievals that were made. And one of the benefits that they were looking at was the staff time that was saved through requesting records from off-site storage. And they were taking such a purist line, which is perfectly defensible. They said, well, we can't average, we don't want to average and predict who the grade of staff that's going to be asking for these, so we're not going to actually record that as a monetary benefit. It could be someone at grade 2 is requesting the file, it could be someone at grade 6 or 7. Because we can't predict that, we're not going to show it as a saving. That was taking a real purist line, saying, unless we know exactly who it is, we're not going to include it. Whereas we had other projects in the same pilot process that said, we've looked back over our records of who does this process, and we're going to take an average midpoint and say it's grade 7. And I think both of those were completely defensible, as long as you are transparent about the basis on which you've done that calculation. So that there's a real sort of fitness for purpose kind of argument. The other is about the sort of the monitoring side of things, and you're saying we've cut a process from 4 days to 2, and someone comes along and says it's 3. Unless you can demonstrate the basis for your assumption that it's been cut from 4 days to 2, then obviously it's always going to be open to challenge. And this is where some of the institutions again did almost, well, they did do a sort of time and motion, and they actually stopwatched the process and repeated that maybe 2 times, maybe half a dozen times, maybe 20 times. It depended on the size and scale of the process. But at least then, they felt that they had something that was robust and credible in terms of this is how long this process takes, rather than sort of asking people, which was one of the weaknesses that we found with the literature review and the records management stuff. Was a lot of the space saving and the time saving was based on people asking questions and saying, how long do you think you spend answering email? And then going back to them saying, how long do you think you spend answering email now? And of course,
yes.
It's open to so many variables. It's just not true.
Because that's where we were starting. We were doing exactly that. We were going and talking to some of the research admin people and saying, well, how long does this take? How long does that take? We had figures from another institution that we were looking at and sort of trying to do a comparison and saying, well, they reckon it takes 5 days to do this bit of the process. Is that more or less than what you think it takes? And I think you've got to be really careful that it doesn't become a stick your finger in the air and think of a number. And if you have got, as you were saying earlier on as well, if you have got data already, because in some cases we probably have got some of the data we want on time and motion. It's probably already stored somewhere. Yeah.
The other thought that occurred to me was if you're talking about a 4-day process, or even a 2-day process, the chances are that actually what you're looking at is a whole bunch of processes that are aggregated together into a bigger process. So I think if you're measuring something in the calculator in terms of days, you're probably missing a whole host of detail underneath that, where you could then get it down to where this part of the process actually represents a sub-process in its own right that we can measure, as does this bit, in which case you're probably then getting down, rather than talking about days, you're actually talking in its component parts in terms of minutes, and then that bit does become easier to measure empirically. And then you can join that together and say, well, end to end, what we've got here is, and then you can start to see the improvements at different parts of the process as well. We've actually managed to really streamline the startup part of the process, or we've acknowledged that we've got a blockage in the middle part of the process, and this is the bit that we've unpacked and we've improved. So it probably is the case also there's a bit more work to be done in terms of delving down to another level of detail, possibly.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it is the case when you're talking about it's a process like pre-award for research award for research grants. That's the context we've been studying in detail. How long does it take to manage the whole approval process internally? Well, that's not one thing. It's a whole pile of different things, isn't it? And so trying to toss up how long that takes depends on who you've ended up having to ask, whether or not they were there, whether or not it was a simple thing, or whether there was a more complex one. So it's then you're averaging. Yeah. It's the other thing I was thinking about was like non-staffing costs. Some of those can be quite large. I mean, one of the things that came up in our project context was data centers and cloud storage, and hosting stuff off-site. And the hosting services off-site, appears to be extremely economically viable because it's so cheap. And I should imagine there's a big difference between institutions in terms of local storage costs. I mean, when we had a quote from our own IT services people here at Sunderland for, and not just storage, this is virtual machine hosting, and it's not just storing data, it's sort of services hosting on virtual machines and everything. But they were quoting us about 17,000 quid for 2 virtual machines. Because of their infrastructure propping the whole thing up, and presumably the fact that not many other people were using it, and they were therefore dividing up their fixed costs by not very many. And so things like that are going to vary between institutions. On your last point as well, I was thinking on the list of the top 10 tips there that you had, I think it was.
Yeah.
Some of these things, of course, aren't going to be saving money at all, and perhaps making a financial saving wasn't the objective. Perhaps the purpose of this process is to actually assay the cost of doing something like complying with a legislative change.
Yep.
So maybe we're not trying to measure money savings at all. Maybe we're actually trying to measure money changes.
Indeed, it could be increasing. Yeah. It could be that you're trying to measure an increased capacity. Whereas before you could only process, 100 invoices, you can now process 200 invoices a week. You're right. It needn't be a financial saving. That tends, through the experience we've had, to be the sort of most people's default for obvious reasons. Oh, yeah. But it need not be, and the calculator can be subtly tweaked to demonstrate that what you've actually got is an increase in capacity rather than a decrease of costs. I'm aware that hopefully that St Andrews have joined us in perhaps various guises and at various times. If you're able to, is there any
mighty
comments?
As Shakespeare would have it. There was a bit of feedback there, Scott.
Hi, thanks for that. Sorry again that I wasn't there earlier on. Technical problems always, but I was managing to get volume right up until it started, and then it just seemed to disappear. So apologies again. Don't know if once we see the slides we can see anything we missed, but definitely useful. The bits a big catch.
Good, excellent. Well, apologies for having to start without you. It's one of those sort of judgment calls, not knowing quite how long you were going to be or whether you'd be able to resolve the problem.
Absolutely, yeah.
From what you've heard, or just be useful to know what stage you're at St Andrews with the calculator. It's a question I asked from Sunderland at the beginning. Is it that you've not yet downloaded it, or have you downloaded it, taken an initial look, or are you using it actively?
Downloaded and taken an initial look. The only problem, that I can see, but you probably mentioned this something in the presentation, is along the lines of a lot of the benefits we're looking are non-monetary, they're non-financial, and it's capturing that. But as I said, you may well have touched on that as you went through. Is that something that you mentioned previously?
Yes, we did. I was going back to the right slide. I think we probably were in on at that part of the conversation when we were looking at the savings in linear meters of storage space, and suggesting that that's one example of where you might have a benefit that you want to capture, but isn't necessarily a financial one. What sort of things did you have in mind for your project and stuff? Anna can maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but just trying to sort of benefit to researchers, things that are harder to capture than just pure money terms. The money is sort of definitely key, but also sort of things like time savings, how much work is saved, things along that line. Yeah, those conceivably you should be able to capture, but not necessarily turn into a monetary benefit if that's not what you want to do. If I go back to this screen, 2.2, which is the main data capture screen, the top 2/3 of this screen really relate to performance improvement.
Yeah.
And you can stop there if you like. So you could just say, well, it used to take this researcher 2 hours to do this process. It's now taking them 30 minutes. And you could record that simply as a performance change of 82% or whatever it happens to be, without then, if you didn't want to, going on and saying, and that equates to so much in terms of a per minute saving and so much in terms of an annual saving. So the examples that you've given in terms of saving a research time theoretically is perfectly doable within the calculator. There may be questions about the practicality of how you measure that, and the need to work with researchers and get their say-so in terms of measuring how long it takes them to do tasks and those sorts of practical problems. But in terms of the problems with the calculator, you could certainly do that.
Perfect.
Where it gets tricky, or if not impossible with the calculator, is if you're wanting to demonstrate that, for example, you're getting more successful in terms of applying for research grants now because of the change you've made. That sort of thing would, I guess you could probably do it within the calculator, but it wouldn't really be the sort of thing that it would be best set up for. That's the kind of thing that would be best captured perhaps using one of the other tools that you may have missed at the outset. I started off by saying that the impact calculator is only one of a number of tools that JISC have developed over the years, and our measurement tools wiki has lots of other examples of calculators, maturity models, and other evaluation tools, and it might be worth taking a look through those to see if there are other ways of measuring benefit to complement the work you're doing with the impact calculator. And just in terms of the feedback thing, I think unfortunately, I think it is you, Scott. I'm not sure if you're working on speakers or not, but it seems to be when your microphone's on that I can hear myself speaking, and I suspect others can too. But
apologies again. Sorry, it's apologies again about all the problems. I don't know if that's any better. I've just tried something else.
It's a bit hard to hear you full stop now. Are there any other questions of detail or overview that would be useful to touch on now? I mean, obviously I'm happy to pick up any questions afterwards by email or whatever, but equally happy to kind of talk to you now.
You would be okay sending us slides through to us, Steve?
Yep, absolutely. I'll send them this morning, so you won't have those. That's absolutely fine. And I certainly would recommend looking at the work from the pilot project. We've summarised. You don't need to read half a dozen detailed evaluation reports, although they are there if you want to. But we've actually extracted the main lessons learned. That's all under the /impact-calculator URL. But they do address quite a few of the sort of issues we've touched on, levels of detail, averaging and identification of metrics. We've also listed all the metrics that those projects used, just to give some ideas in some cases that you might not have considered CO2 emissions as something that would be a metric worth measuring, but with the whole green ICT agenda, in some instances it's actually quite a useful one. So there's a host of stuff there to look at as well. If there aren't any other further questions, then thanks very much for coming along today, as it were. I hope you have found it useful. So I will send the slides through, and if that generates any further discussion or questions, then by all means do get in touch. I think Anna may be writing something at the moment.
Thanks very much, Steve. That's great. Much obliged.
Thanks so much, Steve. Much appreciated.